Good evening, this is the Oscar Expert here with Brother Rowe. We're very excited to bring to you our analysis of I'm Thinking of Ending Things. This is going to be full of spoilers. If you haven't seen it, leave, get out.
What's fundamental to understanding this film is that this is a film from the janitor's perspective. And after the first viewing, this was sort of a thought that popped up like, is this all about the janitor actually in reality? And I didn't know how that could all be possible because this is narrated from Jessie Buckley's perspective. However, everything in the film is pretty much this janitor's imagination. He's essentially invented this female character in order to keep him company and to keep him sort of going in life. One of the most important quotes in the film, animals live in the present, humans cannot, so humans invent hope. He's invented Jessie Buckley because the present is kind of grueling and there's really nothing going for him. And so it's about the inner life of a janitor.
The first time I watched this film, I was kind of confused and put off because I read that he was the janitor and I was kind of like, what? But that means that the person who's the protagonist in the film, who I was trying to understand the whole movie, is not the protagonist, and the protagonist is just Jake. But if you watch it again, it really works. Jessie Buckley is an amalgamation of things that Jake has read and seen. Her name changes at many points. Her occupation changes. She's a poet. She's a painter. The poem that she recites in the car was a poem from a book that was in Jake's room. We actually see his bookshelf, which is kind of key. Pretty much any name on that bookshelf comes up at some point as a reference in this film.
Worth pausing on the bookshelf. I spent like 3 minutes like pausing and like writing down shit, looking at the bookshelf. Very important part of the movie.
Most prominently, most obviously, film critic Pauline Kael, Jessie Buckley in the car ride kind of becomes her at one point in the second car.
Smoking out of nowhere.
Yeah, she is saying verbatim Pauline Kael's review of Woman Under the Influence. And when she's Pauline Kael, Jake is trying to make, smart points about the movie and he pales in comparisons. Jessie Buckley's paintings that she shows on her phone are not her paintings. When she goes into the basement, we see that the paintings that she showed on her phone are on the wall and they are somebody else's art. They're a certain painter's art. And underneath them are Jake's amateur paintings, which look like he's trying to imitate that art style. He wants to be a painter. He wants to be a poet. He wants to be like a film critic.
He wants to be smart.
His mom says at some point in the movie, like, oh, you're just kind of average. You tried really hard, but you're not much of anything. You're just kind of amateur at stuff. That's how Jake feels. And when he's up against these things that he's reading, he feels inferior.
I think Jake's always felt bad about himself for not being as intelligent as others, but really wanting to be that way and striving for it.
Yeah.
This is obvious from the example of that he was awarded when he was 8 a diligence pin, but not the acumen pin. And he's seen wearing the diligence pin as he's feeding his ailing mother. Jake has always wanted to be brilliant, but he's just not. He's mediocre, like a lot of us, like possibly most of us. And so Jessie Buckley is this conversation he gets to have with the art, but it also sort of makes him feel inferior in a way. He can't keep up with her intelligence in these conversations. The life he dreamed of himself seems to come to fruition in the very last scene when he's accepting the Nobel Prize. He dreamed of doing something brilliant, and he had dreamed of having some sort of influence on the world. This is something he was never able to achieve. And I think part of the reason was because he had to take care of his ailing parents. Things like that got in the way, and also just his inhibitions, becoming shy. Going through school and being seen as an outcast had a tremendous effect on his confidence. At an early age, I think it suggested that he was sort of set in motion to not really achieve very much in life.
And also having parents who are kind of like incapable of thinking abstractly and relating to Jake on the things that he likes to talk about. His dad is completely hilariously incapable of perceiving abstract art. And his mother goes, oh, the colors are nice. Like, they just don't get him. She says after the 7th grade, she was kind of incapable of understanding what Jake was talking about. So for his whole life, he's felt lonely and isolated. And now he's this janitor, which is kind of this embodiment of like the low life of society. Someone who kind of wanders the hallways alone and is unnoticed. He feels like the work he's done is unnoticed. He feels like the attention that he gave to his dying mother goes unnoticed. And in many ways, he feels like that pig who just rotted in the barn. That story he tells of the pig, like you can tell that really that event traumatized him because he thought, well, life is like really brutal and gross and I feel that.
Well, I think there's a more direct connection with the pig in that he sees himself in the pig because an idea is sort of analogous to a virus. And the idea that infects him in this movie is I could just end things. I could just end my life and get off of this like awful train. And that's the idea that eats away inside of him, just like the maggots, that eventually leads to his death. It leads to him killing himself. It's the idea that Jessie Buckley is grappling with the entire film, where she's thinking of ending things with Jake. I'm thinking of ending things as a double entendre for both suicide and ending this relationship. And the consequence of Jessie Buckley, who represents like hope for himself and in his future, hope for, having any kind of happiness, breaking that relationship with himself, giving up on himself, leads to his demise.
Why does the movie depict Jake as somebody who's in a relationship with a girl? Because he's in a relationship with himself. He's in a relationship with his internal world.
Along with the point of Jessie Buckley being this amalgamation of ideas that other people have had, Jake's concept of the world and of himself is entirely composed of these influences he has, like the films he watches, the books he reads, the philosophy he consumes. None of it's like original thoughts. So there's a very postmodern philosophy underlying a lot of this film. Even the speech he makes in this like afterlife speech he is giving is from A Beautiful Mind, where he says the greatest like logic in life means nothing without love, or something along those lines. He's inhabiting a world where he's unable to like make any real contribution, and they're just sort of ideas imposing themselves onto him. It's a world where there's really no hope for like originality or contributing anything to anybody. This is definitely underlying like his loneliness of not being able to contribute to the world. There are a few brilliant people in the world whose thoughts and ideas really influence like the general population, and he's just not smart enough to be one of those people.
He sort of has this desire to be an original, and he also has a kind of intense longing for his childhood. At one point he says like, yes, indisputably, being a kid is better. It's hopeful. It's more joyous. The Tulsi Town jingle like makes him really happy. He misses those days when there was like an innocence around that.
He also can't eat the ice cream
without
thinking
now.
It's too sweet. I think childhood is just where he is able to be the most optimistic about the future, and then the movie's sort of about like the reality of how his life would eventually turn out setting in. I think his arc through the film, it's kind of like Amadeus in a funny way, like just accepting that he is not going to really amount to anything, and looking at himself through the eyes of like someone he does find interesting, Jessie Buckley. He doesn't really see anything that's worth keeping there. Like he doesn't see any part of his life that's worth living and worth pursuing.
The whole film is kind of about the harsh reality knocking at the door this whole time. You've got Jessie Buckley, whose character is thinking of ending things, thinking of suicide, who keeps wanting to go home. And it's implied that this is going to be the last time she ever sees him when she goes home. Jessie Buckley is saying, the blizzard is getting too strong, I have to go home. The blizzard, in a more obvious way, it's like this harsh, cold reality. The car is kind of like the warm, contained place where he has his fantasy, and the outside is like this blizzard constantly wiping away, we're not going to let the snow pile on, we're not going to let the snow pile on. What is the last image in this film? The snow has piled onto the pickup truck where Jake, the janitor, is inside. It is implied that he killed himself of hypothermia. Earlier on, Jessie Buckley says, I wonder what it would be like to just die of hypothermia. He kills himself because he surrenders to the blizzard and it just piles on top of him and he freezes in the cold, harsh reality.
And the windshield wipers are also like a ticking clock. Did you think that too?
No, but that's a good point.
I definitely thought that. Like, they're going through time, but they're also like, time is really blowing past them like a cold wind is how it's described in the film. And really, time is just this sort of like antagonizing force.
He retreats to different points in his life in order to avoid the blizzard as well.
Very, very fucking bleak, okay?
Yeah. I think we should break down what happens from the climax onward, because it's just the most like confusing
like the ending
part.
When I say climactic moment or climax in this film, it's like the point of there's no going back, a final decision has been made. There's been sort of a reconciling of like the battle that's been taking place all film, which is when the janitor meets Jessie Buckley in his older form. He kind of accepts this idea like, I know I'm just the guy who never said hi to that girl that I really wanted.
when she's speaking to the janitor, she kind of becomes the person that he knew that she was all along. So in reality, she tells this story at the dinner table and she tells it to the janitor again. She saw him at some sort of party or event, and he was just some kind of creepy guy to her who wouldn't really leave her alone. She didn't like him. In the dinner scene, she starts to tell a story. The reality starts to break, and she goes, "Yeah, and he was like annoying, and I didn't like him." And then Toni Collette goes, "You didn't like him?" And then the fantasy turns on again, and she goes, "I did." It's just a point in the middle where the reality slips. He offers her slippers, where earlier in the film he did this in the house and she accepted them. Now when he offers this to her, she doesn't accept because he's unable to give her anything. I think this is sort of his revelation. He's just consuming from her what he hopes to gain from this imaginary relationship, and he actually has nothing to offer her in return, not even like slippers to keep her feet warm. It really hits home with how lonely he is, where he's not able to make an impact on anybody. And so realizing that he was just nobody to anybody for most of his life, he says like a tearful goodbye to her. And there's this sort of like celebration, which is the dance of like what he could have had. Or in my mind, it's not only what he could have had with someone if he were to like meet a nice girl, get married. It was celebrating the relationship he once had with this girl in his head. Like they have had this sort of life together, but in the process, he became like very controlling of that and possessive of it. And I think the novelty of her existence was sort of worn off. And in the dance, he is the antagonist as the janitor.
He murders his self that has all this potential, that has all these like original thoughts, all the optimism.
And then after the dance, he goes in the car, he takes off his clothes. I think that this is the way that he died. He took off all his clothes and died of hypothermia. But in the car, he watches the Tulsi Town advertisement from his childhood, and then the pig is there, and it's obviously the same pig from the barn who died. It gets out of that like black spot, shakes the maggots off, and this pig has some things to say. The most important thing I got out of what the pig says to him is like, somebody's got to be the pig with maggots. That's just like him accepting like, yep, I'm just nothing to nobody.
Or I was like just chosen for no reason to live like the most horrible life.
After that, we see the play with the fake old people makeup. I'm not really exactly sure what that is. It's just kind of funny. I don't know if it's like kind of knocking at fake biopic movie makeup. But nonetheless, we have Jesse Plemons performing in front of a large audience a song from the musical Oklahoma, which, as we know, he's seen performed every few years as the janitor. It's just basically starts out as an ode to his loneliness. And then it's this bright light comes in. The woman that he wants isn't repulsed by his arms, I think is what he says. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of just like the role that his imagination plays for him. This bright light in the play. The end of the play is the character, I think, acknowledging that he should leave the room and enter reality or something, but that character never does that, of course, the real Jake.
He makes this proclamation that he's going to get a bride. That's the end of the song. Yeah. He's like doing it all for Jesse Buckley, who isn't even real. Like that's his drive throughout life. It's like, I'm going to get this girl. I'm not just going to be alone anymore. I just love this song at the end. I think the lyrics are insanely fitting. And if you want to understand the film better, I think a great thing to do is just watch that scene. Because ultimately, like that is his life. It is a microcosm of the film. It is a janitor alone in a room, alone in his head. He's just watching like shadows on the walls and just imagining what his life could be, but he in reality has absolutely nothing.
In spite of the movie being so cynical, where it's just about a guy who accepts that he's a pig with maggots and kills himself, I think there's something beautiful about the fact that we get to see the complex inner workings of this man's brain that nobody would ever notice, that he would probably love for people to notice. And it's just such an interesting way to do a character study, where the actual main character is on screen for like barely any of it, and everybody else is an embodiment of his internal world. The protagonist isn't even who you think it is. The entire world is subjective, and that's what makes everything so ripe for analysis, because if everything's a projection, then you can kind of pick apart each piece of it and say, like, which part of his mind is this?
If there's any criticism I have of the film, it's that some lines of the dialogue, like particularly at the end, a couple things the pig says, I think they're a little bit too out of like left field to resonate with anything that the story seems more truly about. I think there are plenty of points in the film that people will find like, oh, I don't really know how that part makes sense with the rest of the film because it is so dense and it does try to cram a lot in. But that's definitely a problem that I don't really mind having. And I have found that I thought that about a couple things in Synecdoche, New York, that when I watched it later, I was like, no, actually that resonated this time. That made sense.
You know, the movie is definitely a testament to the subjective reality that we all have. And it suggests that these realities are just as tangible and real to us as anything. I don't love it when a movie is like, oh, this just wasn't real. But this movie kind of gets around that because even though nothing's real, the movie's suggestion is that everything is absolutely real because it exists in your mind and your mind is so powerful.
Ideas in this film are very real and tangible. They can literally infect you and eat you from the inside. Definitely about the power of the human mind and how we retreat into our internal world when life kind of sucks.
And it's kind of a brave assertion that the movie makes that like we're just comprised of the things that we've consumed. Because I think we all would like to think of ourselves as originals, but we are kind of influenced by what we watch, what we read. I mean, that's probably like a scary amount of who we actually are.
Yeah, I think there's a overall view of the world that is we're just in like this echo chamber where ideas are just bouncing off of the walls and we become those ideas. I mean, this is part of that Guy Debord essay that they're referencing. We're just the product of media and culture, also of the labels that other people put on us.
It's also a film about the intimate relationship that we have with ourselves, how real that relationship is, and how we invent things in order to keep ourselves like alive, essentially.
It's a lot like Anomalisa in that it's about one person who doesn't have anybody in his life, really. Anomalisa is different because it's about how he can't actually see anybody. He can't really experience another person for like who they are or what they are. This film, he's alone, but it's because he's not contributing anything to anybody else. That's why when he tries to give her the slippers in the end, what's so tragic is that he doesn't have anything to offer her. He's just in a void with himself. There's just nothing that he can possibly give.
And like Anomalisa and Synecdoche, New York, it's very much a film about the subjective experience of the protagonist. And that's why the first viewing kind of confused me because I thought it was about Jessie Buckley, and it's not. The entire thing's about Jake, and it's only about Jake. I've heard some people say that they don't really love Charlie Kaufman as a director because he seems too, like, maybe up his own ass. I'm not going to disagree that he's, like, up his ass or self-indulgent, but that's where I think that his movies as a director, his work as a director is becoming really interesting because these three films feel separated from the work that he did with Spike Jonze and Michel Gondry in just like how subjective they are, lost in like their own surreal headspace. But I think that that's what makes them fascinating. I think the fact that Kaufman has more control is what's contributing to the movies being like that.
I also don't like that self-indulgent is a criticism for him because he's not doing it to be better than you. The reason his films come off as self-indulgent is because he's in touch with like the ugly parts of himself and he's putting them out there to display for all of us so that we can identify with those parts of ourselves and come to terms with them. His films recently have been really about the disappointment of life, and it's hard for somebody to make work that's like that honest about, you know, how much you might dislike your life or how alone you feel. And these may or may not be his feelings, like, I don't know, but I think they're a part of our lives. That's all that he's trying to do. I don't think he's trying to be smarter than you or more clever than you. I mean, the film seems to be an admission that there's no originality in the first place, so. But Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is a very original movie. Like, fuck you.
Hope you enjoyed our analysis. Hope you got something out of it. If you were sort of unsure about the movie and a lot of this made you go, huh, I would highly encourage you to rewatch it.
Really hope this movie ages well over time and people remember it. I hope to see it on the best of the decade lists. I think it might be on mine.
Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. What does your inner pig tell you?